And actually put that up, Seth. We'll start with that. And why are we just want to share this first. Why are we doing this series? Well, 1 Chronicles 12 talks about when David was made king over all Israel. He was the second king. And the reaction of many of the military men, the fighting men from all over Israel, they were coming to voluntarily put themselves under David's leadership because they realized that he was the one chosen of God to lead them as God's royal nation. Verse 32, put up the next verse here, 1 Chronicles 12:32, it says, there were those of the men of Issachar, and they had understanding of the times to know what Israel ought to do. These men of Issachar, they said, this David, God chose him to be our king. Samuel anointed him when he was just a young boy many years ago to be king. And now, just as it was spoken, he is king, and he is establishing God's kingdom, and we want to serve under you, David, because we understand the times and we know what to do. And in the same way, there is one who is coming soon to establish God's kingdom. His name is Jesus Christ. And because we have understanding of the times, we know what to do, and that is to draw near to the Lord Jesus Christ, who is preparing to establish his kingdom. And that's what we'll do in this part 2 class. We'll just do a quick review. We probably won't look at any of the verses, maybe we will, but last class I should say, we basically established the structure through which all of God's prophetic plan follows, okay? And that began with God in Genesis 12 speaking to Abraham. And he said to Abraham, Abraham, even though you're 75 and your wife is 65, put up Genesis 12, verse 1, Seth. He said, I'm going to raise up a great nation through you, and I'm going to give your people this land as their own, and one of your future descendants will be a blessing to all the families of the earth. This is the Abrahamic covenant, and that happened around 2000 BC. So as we go quickly through the history of Israel and the Old Testament, we see that Abraham and Sarah had a son, Isaac. Isaac had a son, Jacob. Jacob had 12 sons. Those are in Genesis 35. We don't have to read them. But one of the sons, Judah, who was his fourth actually, something is prophesied about him in Genesis 49, verse 8. And this is what was said about the house of Judah. It said, Judah, you are he whom your brethren shall praise. Your hand shall be in the neck of your enemies. Your father's children shall bow down before you. So Judah would have a supremacy over the other 11 families, we could say, of the nation of Israel. And then verse 10, the scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor a lawgiver from between his feet, until Shiloh comes, and unto him, unto Shiloh, proper noun, speaking of someone special, that's actually a term for the coming Messiah, the son of Abraham, and unto him shall the gathering of the people be. So this is a prophecy that the one who will come from Israel, the son of Abraham, who will be a blessing to all the nations of the earth, he will come through Israel, through the house of Judah. So that's beautiful. And then as we go further down, now we come to about 1000 BC. David has become the second king of Israel, and put up 2 Samuel chapter 5, verse 5. And we see that very early in David's reign as king, next verse please, verse 6, we see that David and his men went to Jerusalem Jerusalem was a large city in the mountains of the land that God had given Israel, but they had not yet taken control of it. But this passage tells us that after David became king, they went up and they conquered that city, and that is where David established the seat, the base of his kingdom in Jerusalem. Then in 2 Samuel verse 13, David wants to build a temple, a house, to glorify the true God, the God of Israel. But God comes to David in 2 Samuel 7:13 and says, David, I'm going to build a house for you because I'm going to raise up one of your descendants, and he shall build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. Verse 16. And your house and your kingdom shall be established forever before you. Your throne shall be established forever. And David understood that God was saying to him, David, the deliverer, the Messiah, the coming king that I have promised to send into this world through the nation I've raised up through Abraham, Israel, David, you are of the house of Judah, and the Messiah will be your direct descendant. So we are seeing as God's prophetic plan is unfolding through the nation of Israel, we see that God said to Abraham, I will raise up a nation. Through you, Abraham, I will give them land to dwell in. I will send one of your people into this world who will be a blessing to all nations, and he will be a king with a kingdom, and he will establish his throne in Jerusalem. And we see this in Isaiah chapter 9. After this promise God makes to David, the Old Testament prophets begin to make very specific future predictions about the coming king. In Isaiah 9 verse 6, this is about 750 BC, about 250 years after God gave David the promise of the Messiah coming through. It says, unto us a child is born, unto us a son is given, and the government shall be upon his shoulder, and his name shall be called Wonderful, Counselor, Mighty God, the Everlasting Father, the Prince of Peace. Of the increase of his government and peace, there shall be no end upon the throne of David and upon his kingdom, to order it and to establish it with judgment and with justice from henceforth, even forever. And then put up Isaiah chapter 2, verse 1. And this is the word that Isaiah, the son of Amos, saw concerning Judah and Jerusalem. And it shall come to pass in the last days that the mountain of the Lord's house shall be established in the top of the mountains, and shall be exalted above the hills, and all nations shall flow to it. And many people shall go and say, come, let's go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob. People from all nations will say this. And he will teach us of his ways, and we will walk in his paths. For out of Zion in Jerusalem shall go forth the law and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. So the coming king, coming through Israel, coming through the house of Judah, a direct descendant of David, who will establish his throne and his kingdom in Jerusalem over all the earth. That is the prophetic structure of God's plan. But then last verse of the review, Zechariah 12, verse 2, tells us that even though Jerusalem is God's choice for his king's kingdom over all the earth, we are told God says, behold, I will make Jerusalem a cup of trembling unto all the people round about. Next verse. And in that day will I make Jerusalem a burdensome stone for all people. All that burden themselves with it shall be cut in pieces, though all the people of the earth be gathered together against it. So isn't it amazing that the prophecies of the Bible say that the very same city that will be the throne of God over all the earth will also be the city, God says, where all nations of the earth will be gathered against it. And we see that subtly today, where Jerusalem is in a tug of war for control, for access, for dominion from all three major religions. The Jews, the Christians, the Muslims, all laying some kind of claim to Jerusalem. And the plan of the United Nations, the global governing agency, they want to divide it. If we had the chance to stand up in the United Nations, someone say, hey, God's plan through Jesus Christ is that Jerusalem would be the headquarters of his kingdom. But say, oh, no, it's not. We're going to divide it. We don't want that to happen. So it's amazing what we see happening. So now, let's look at part 2 of our prophecy series and put up Matthew chapter 3, verse 1. And let's see what happens. We're going to read some amazing passages that the Lord Jesus Christ himself shared in relation to God's prophetic plan, especially in the last days. So in Matthew 3, in those days, this is the time of Jesus Christ, in those days came John the Baptist preaching in the wilderness of Judea and saying, repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand. So what was John the Baptist's message? He was saying, hey, the promised king that God told us he would send through our nation, the son of Abraham, the son of Israel, through the house of Judah, the son of David, he's coming to establish the kingdom that the prophets have told us about. And that was John the Baptist's message. And then Jesus comes and Jesus begins to perform his ministry and to teach and to share and to reveal the person and character and glory of God through his ministry. So now, fast forwarding, because we're kind of focusing on prophetic truths here, let's go to Tuesday of Passion Week, 3 days before the Lord will go to the cross. And in Matthew chapter 24, verse 1. Okay. What has just taken place is a story that many of us have heard, where they're taking an offering in the temple, and the widow, the precious widow, throws her 2 mites into the offering. Their hearts, 2 mites, like a penny. And Jesus says, I tell you, her offering is worth more than everyone else's combined, because they all gave from their excess, but she gave all that she had. And right immediately after this, in Matthew 24, verse 1, Jesus went out and departed from the temple, and his disciples came to him to show him the buildings of the temple, the glorious temple that Herod had built for the Jewish people just before the time of the Lord. And Jesus said to them, do you not see all these things? I tell you, there shall not be left here one stone upon another that shall not be thrown down. Now, Jesus said something similar to this way back in the first beginnings of his ministry in John 2, when he said, in the presence of the Jews in the temple, said, tear this house down and I will rebuild it in 3 days. And they said, this temple has taken 47 years to build, and you're going to rebuild it in 3 days? So here's Jesus again now at the end of his ministry. And he's saying, you see this glorious, majestic house of worship that when I'm telling you, the day's coming when there won't be one stone of it left. And in Luke 21, verse 5, we see this is a parallel passage. Matthew 24 and Luke 21 are parallel chapters of the same conversation, the same discourse that the Lord is about to give about the prophetic plan of God following the culmination of his death, burial, and resurrection. And as some spake of the temple, how it was adorned with beautiful stones and gifts, he said, as for these things which you behold, the days will come in the which there shall not be left one stone upon another that shall not be thrown down. So Matthew 24, Luke 20, we're seeing the same conversation. And Jesus saying pretty much the same thing. But here's what's amazing. Here's what happens, folks. Let's see how the disciples responded to what he had just said. And in Matthew 24:4, let's see Matthew 24:3. Here's how the disciples responded. And as he sat upon the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately, saying, tell us, when shall these things be? Tell us, when will these things be? When will the destruction of the temple that you're talking about happen? And what shall be the sign of your coming and of the end of the world? Now let's go to Luke 21 again, Seth. Put up verse 5. It's verse 5. Luke 21, verse 5. Okay, verse 7. This is how the disciples responded to what Jesus said according to Luke 21:7. And they asked him, saying, Master, but when shall these things be? And what sign will there be when these things shall come to pass? So Luke says that they said, well, Lord, what will be the time and the signs of this destruction you're talking about? And that was how Luke recorded their response. But in Matthew 24, put up Matthew 24:3 again, Seth. We see that Matthew says he didn't just ask them about the signs of the coming destruction of the temple, but they also asked him questions related to what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the world. So there's actually 4 questions that they asked him when he told them that they were going to see the temple destroyed. They asked him, when will it happen? They said, what will be the sign? And what will be the sign of your coming and the end of the world? Now, why did they ask him the second 2 questions also? What will be the sign of your coming and the end of the world? How did they know that he was coming a second time? And the amazing answer to that question is just maybe a few days or a week or 2 weeks earlier in Luke 17 and 18, for the first time in those 2 chapters, Jesus had referred to a second coming that he would make. He said, but when the Son of Man returns, will he find faith on the earth? That was his first mention of the subject. So the disciples, hearing Jesus say that the temple is going to be destroyed, they asked him, well, what will be the sign of this destruction, Lord? What will be the sign that's about to happen? When will it happen? And also, Lord, what will be the sign of your second coming and the end of the world? So they asked him 4 questions in response to his declaration of this pending destruction of the temple. And just as God always does, Jesus gave An amazing answer. And he continues in Luke 21, as also parallel Matthew 24. He shares what is known as the Olivet Discourse. Now in Matthew 24, the content there deals mostly with the events of the last days just before his return. But in Luke 21, Jesus actually shares more details about what's going to happen in reference to the destruction of the temple and how it pertains to the last days and his return. So put up verse 20, Luke 21:20. And this is what Jesus says. And he's going to answer the first two questions. When will the temple destruction happen? And what will be the sign that it's about to happen? He answers those two questions in this passage. He says, when you shall see Jerusalem surrounded with armies, then know that its desolation is near. Then let them which are in Judea flee to the mountains, and let them which are in the midst of it depart, and let not them that are in the countries enter thereinto. For these be the days of vengeance, that all things which are written may be fulfilled. But woe unto them that are with child, and to them that give suck in those days, for there shall be great distress in the land of Israel, in the city of Jerusalem, and wrath upon this people. And they shall fall by the edge of the sword, and shall be led away captive into all nations, and Jerusalem shall be trodden down, trampled, ruthlessly controlled by the Gentile nations for an undefined period of time, until the time of Gentile domination over Jerusalem has been completed. So in this passage, Jesus is actually giving a prophetic description of what will happen when Jerusalem and the temple is destroyed. And what he was referring to, this is amazing, he said, these be the times of vengeance. These be the days of vengeance, that those things which are written might be fulfilled. Now, what was he referring to? Put up Daniel 9, verse 25. Stuff. This is amazing because Daniel wrote this prophecy about 550 years before the birth of Christ. This prophecy is called the 70 weeks of Daniel, but specifically in this prophecy, Daniel gives a timeline where he says at the end of this timeline, Messiah, the coming prince, shall come. And then in verse 26, he says, after 62 weeks shall Messiah be killed. He shall be executed as a criminal, and after the Messiah comes and is killed, according to Daniel's prophecy, he says, the people of the prince that shall come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary. So Daniel in chapter 9, 500 plus years before the coming of Christ, Daniel was saying, God is saying in his prophetic plan that when the king comes, he won't come and establish his kingdom on his first coming, but he will be killed. And after he's killed, Jerusalem, the city, the temple will be destroyed. So now we go back to Luke 21, verse 20, and in this passage, this is what Jesus is referring to. He is affirming the prophecy of hundreds of years back by Daniel, and he is reminding those that are paying attention that he, as the Messiah, the Prince, will die. And according to God's prophetic plan, Israel will be judged, Jerusalem and the temple will be destroyed, and that's exactly what happened Jesus is saying this in 30 AD, and he's talking about Jerusalem being surrounded by armies. 40 years later, when the Jews revolted against the Romans, and the Romans sieged Jerusalem, and horrible things took place, and they ended up breaking through and destroying Jerusalem, tearing the temple apart stone by stone till not one stone was left, just like the Lord said. And the Jews, it's called the diaspora, they were taken prisoners and sent as slaves by the thousands throughout the Roman Empire, and Israel as a nation ceased to exist in 70 AD. But Jesus also answered their last two questions, because they said, Lord, when will this destruction happen? What will be the sign that it's about to happen? And he answered those two questions. But they also asked him, Lord, what will be the sign of your coming and the end of the world? And Jesus answered that question with one word in verse 24, when he said, the Jews shall fall by the edge of the sword and shall be led away captive into all nations, and Jerusalem shall come under the control of Gentile nations for an undefined period of time, until the Gentile domination of Jerusalem has been completed. So Jesus, with one amazing word, says, but a day will come until when Jerusalem will once again be put back into the hands of the Jewish people after many generations of control from the Gentile nations. And that's what we will cover in part 3. So thank you for watching us in this amazing part 2 of this series.